A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
I've always prided myself on being the kind of person who does right by others. I've donated to charity, volunteered at animal shelters, mentored kids from underprivileged backgrounds, you name it, I've done it. For years, I wore this goodness like a badge of honor, thinking it was all that mattered. But I've recently had a disturbing revelation, one that's shaken me to my core. I'm a good person, yes, but I'm not a nice person. This might sound like semantics, but let me explain. It all started on an ordinary Tuesday when a knock on my front door interrupted my evening routine. The face behind the peephole was unfamiliar, yet there was something unsettling about the man's eyes. They glinted with a strange intensity as if harboring a secret they intended to share whether I liked it or not. Against my better judgment, I opened the door. His presence was disarming, not for any overt threat, but because of his calm insistence that he had something important to say to me. "You've always thought of yourself as someone who does the right thing," he began, his voice almost hypnotic in its evenness, "but you've never considered the cost of that goodness." I should have shut the door in his face, but something about his words stopped me cold. He went on to recount incidents from my life, things only I could know. He talked about the time I had called out a colleague for plagiarism, a good deed that had effectively ruined her career. He reminded me of the protest I had organized against a local business for unethical practices, a campaign that had led to layoffs and financial hardship for dozens of employees. Finally, he mentioned my decision to step in when a friend was having marital issues. My interference, though well-intentioned, had resulted in an ugly divorce. I felt a growing nausea in my gut as he unearthed these memories. I had never stopped to consider the collateral damage of my actions. The man called what I did good but not nice, and that distinction was tearing me apart. Was it possible to be morally right yet utterly lacking in empathy? As horrifying as it was to admit, I couldn't deny the truth of what he said. My goodness had been weaponized, wielded like a blunt instrument with no regard for the casualties left in its wake. I asked him why he came to tell me this, and he simply smiled, a chilling expression devoid of warmth. "Because it's time you faced it," he said. With that cryptic statement, he turned and walked away, leaving me to stew in a swamp of doubt and self-loathing. I tried to forget his visit, but his words clung to my thoughts like a stubborn echo. My life, once a tapestry of pride and accomplishment, now seemed more akin to a patchwork of unintended harm. In my pursuit of integrity, I realized I had strayed from kindness, a realization forcing me to confront the shadows of my own conscience. The weight of it was suffocating, and for the first time, I questioned my own moral compass. Were my motivations ever truly selfless, or were they driven by a need for validation? I found myself avoiding interactions, fearful of the damage my good intentions might inflict. Paradoxically, my newfound awareness freed me from the illusion of moral superiority and shackled me with the burden of doubt. However, this internal crisis birthed a change, a resolve to listen first, act later. As weeks turned into months, I learned to embrace the chaos of others' lives without imposing my sanctimonious judgments. Though the path was fraught with challenges, I realized the true hell wasn't in being a bad person, but in being good without being nice. That anonymous visitor had been a catalyst, a haunting enigma that empowered me to redefine my humanity. Perhaps I'll never know who he was or why he chose me, but one thing is certain, he changed my life. Now, whenever I reflect on my actions, I carry with me the nagging reminder of what it means to be good and why it's more important, albeit harder, to be nice. It all started when I found a penny on the ground outside a rundown convenience store, one of those places you wouldn't typically enter unless absolutely necessary. The penny was unnaturally shiny, so bright it almost looked new, but it was definitely a penny, and I made a wish out of habit, thinking about how my grandmother always said a penny could bring you luck if you found it heads up. I tossed it into my pocket and forgot about it until the next morning, when I woke up to an unexpected text informing me I'd won a small lottery prize. Even better, it was a ticket I'd bought on a whim the day before, and before I could even process my luck, things just kept getting better. The very next week, I found another penny, this one equally lustrous, and without thinking twice, I wished again. Again, I ended up winning something, the job promotion I'd been chasing for years, a leap in my career that had seemed impossible only days before. Over the next month, I kept finding these otherworldly pennies, one after another, each more astonishing than the last. I bought a new car, went on luxurious trips, and felt the thrill of prosperity dancing in my bones. It was like a dream, until it wasn't. The last penny I found was dropped just as I left a bustling cafe, unsettling as it seemed to roll away from my foot before abruptly stopping. I picked it up eagerly, wishing for my luck to continue, convinced I was on this golden path, but the moment I pocketed that penny, things soured. My promotion turned into a nightmare week of horrible, disastrous meetings that culminated in a scathing performance review. Then, I got a call that my sister had been in a car accident. Thankfully, she survived, but the emotional toll was overwhelming. I numbly tried to find comfort again in my shiny, cursed pennies, repeating the ritual, each time making a new wish, but the more I wished on those pennies, the darker the world around me became. I started noticing shadows that seemed to flicker and fade at the edges of my vision, but when I turned my head, they'd vanish, and every time I opened my wallet, the pennies shone all the brighter, the weight of them in my pocket almost tangible with an energy that felt wrong. A week later, I found myself in line at a supermarket when the cashier's voice dropped, and I instantly felt it, an oppressive fear lurking behind me. A man stood there, his presence suffocating, but when I turned around, he vanished, as if he had never been there at all. When I got home, I noticed that every single penny I'd collected was now blackened and tarnished, as if a dark stain had spread over their once bright surfaces. My dreams shifted from visions of money and success to nightmares of grotesque figures lurking in the shadows, whispering my name, echoing with a sinister promise as their faces twisted in mockery. My fortune had deteriorated into horror. As the days crawled on, I felt increasingly hunted, as if something was attaching itself to me through these so-called lucky charms. I tried to rid myself of them, tossing the pennies into the river, but the next morning, they'd somehow returned, glimmering under my bed, beckoning me back into their dark embrace. That's when I reached my breaking point. I decided to confront my luck directly and went back to the convenience store where it had all begun, demanding answers from the clerk, who only looked at me with hollow eyes, recognizing too late that I was not the first to come looking for help. He revealed that there was a curse woven into every penny: the more you use them for your greed, the more they preyed on your spirit. I realized with chilling horror that the wish I had made for prosperity had opened a gateway for something dark and insatiable, a force that fed off my desires. Alone in my apartment, those shriveled pennies taunted me mercilessly, reflections of everything I had lost, haunts that represented all my misbegotten wishes. I hatched a desperate plan to excise my mistake, gathering the cursed coins in a bag and heading out under the cover of night to a cemetery far away from my home, hoping to bury them in the earth, the only thing that could possibly rid me of the weight I was carrying. As I dug into the soil, tossing the coins into the pit, I felt a heavy presence grow palpable behind me, but I didn't dare look back until I was finished. The moment I turned, there he was, the man from the store, his face now twisted into a grotesque mask of fury. Realizing far too late that the coins must have demanded a sacrifice, my body froze in dread as his voice rumbled like an earthquake, claiming my soul as the final payment for the fine glimmer of promises betrayed. Pennies went from lucky to my worst nightmare, and as I felt myself being dragged into darkness, I wondered if somewhere out there was another hopeful soul who'd unknowingly inherit my cursed fate, and all I could do was whisper a warning as I slipped into the abyss: some luck is better left unfound. I never thought I'd be labeled an asshole, especially not on a platform like a myth asshole, but sometimes life throws you into situations that seem so surreal, so twisted that even you can't believe what you've done. It all started with a phone call late one night. My fiancée, Jamie, was sobbing on the other end, her voice cracking as she told me that her mother had passed away unexpectedly. My gut twisted as I listened to her, the heartache flooding through the line, but as the shock wore off, reality began to sink in. Jamie's mom had always been a difficult person, and our relationship had been strained at best. We would clash every time we met, her barbed comments making laughter feel like a competition of sorts, her judgmental eyes like daggers that cut through the pretense of family gatherings. Yet, no matter how hard I tried to avoid conflict, her presence loomed over our relationship like a suffocating cloud. Jamie had always felt torn between love for her mother and the discomfort her mother brought into our lives, and now, standing in the shadow of grief, those old resentments resurfaced. When Jamie asked me how we would pay for the funeral, I hesitated. I remember the moment clearly, the noise of our living room, the smell of the takeout I had just brought back to celebrate an engagement that now felt devoid of joy. There was something about the way she said it, the expectation in her voice, and for a split second, I thought about our finances, our future. I hesitated, weighing the memories of her mother's nasty remarks against the guilt that already crept in like a thief in the night. "I'm sorry, but my own family has debt. I can't afford to pay for someone who never respected me," I finally said, and the silence that followed was deafening. It felt like I had just announced an apocalypse, the end of a world that I had poured everything into. I thought Jamie might understand, I thought she would at least appreciate my honesty. but the call spiraled downhill. While I had imagined her crying because of grief, her wails now sounded like a wild animal caught in a trap, shrill and devastating, and hearing her pain was like plunging a knife deeper into my own gut. She hung up on me, and for days, the silence between us grew heavier, thicker like the fog that rolls through our sleepy town. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jamie's face contorted with betrayal, her mother's sneering visage hovering in the background like a specter. Our wedding plans began to unravel, mutual friends nervously tiptoed around the subject, neither of us brave enough to bring up the blame that now tainted our love. The funeral came, and I didn't go. I spent the day locked in our apartment, drowning myself in video games and social media, scrolling through posts until my brain turned numb. When I finally summoned the courage to reach out to Jamie, there was no response, just a collection of cold, unsettling echoing voices from our past families, tearing at the seams. It was only a few days later that I received the invitation to a different gathering, a dinner at Jamie's aunt's house. Her family was gathering to remember her late mother, and I felt a tide of emotions rise again: guilt, dread, and the painful dullness of regret. Despite everything, I showed up, hoping maybe I could salvage what was left of our engagement, but what was waiting for me was a scene from a horror flick. Jamie was there, and the icy looks from her relatives could have frozen the flames of hell itself. "You," her aunt snarled, "you're the reason Jamie's heartbroken, the reason she's lost her way." That single sentence slammed down on me like a tombstone. The last spark of hope fizzled out as family members chimed in, airing their grievances. They painted me as the villain, the man who had turned his back on a grieving widow. It felt surreal, like I was being dragged into a dark theater where I wasn't even a star of the show. The audience shared whispers, murmurs that turned into a cacophony, and in that moment, I realized I was trapped in a nightmare of my own making. I tried to explain my position, but each word only fueled their outrage, the storm of judgment crashing onto my shoulders. And it was at that moment, as Jamie turned her face from me, that I felt a sense of icy clarity. She wasn't angry at me for refusing to pay, she was furious because she was caught between her loyalty to her mother's memory and us. I wanted to run, to escape the scrutiny and the suffocating despair that was threatening to swallow me whole. That night, I typed my story on a myth asshole, looking for some reflection, a glimmer of shared experience, expecting to find sympathy. Instead, it was like igniting a fuse leading to chaos, an avalanche of comments tearing me apart, judging every word I had shared, laying bare my soul for everyone to spit on. "If you don't care about your fiancé's grief, you're the asshole," one user wrote, and I felt the heaviness of despair wrap around me again, each notification bullying me like a gang of hyenas feasting on a carcass. The post went viral, tearing through the comment sections like wildfire, opinions flying from every direction, and before I knew it, I was battling trolls online who veiled their vitriol beneath the guise of concern. The next morning, I woke up to a storm. My phone was alive with allegations, insults, people accusing me of being heartless. It was like each notification was a stab, each comment a reminder of how I had failed. Jamie called later that day, and while her voice quaked with emotion, I felt nothing but numbness creeping through the hollow shell I had become. She didn't say much, hardly spoke at all, but the silence was rife with an unspoken truth that haunted me deeply. I had lost her, and there was nothing I could do to change that. She informed me that her family would take care of everything and that she didn't want to have anything to do with someone who couldn't understand the core of family, grief, and support. The call ended, and with it, any thread of hope I had clung to for dear life unraveled before my eyes. I sat there, alone in a sea of my own desolation, staring at the notifications that seemed to mock me, reading over and over the comments that encapsulated my nightmare. Days blurred into weeks, I still find myself contemplating those moments regularly, as if they flicker like a film reel in my mind. Did I handle it poorly? Am I actually the asshole in this story? Yet what haunts me the most is that lingering thought: how could a simple decision, one rooted in financial reality, turn into something so irrevocably tragic? Now, as life unfurls like a tattered scroll of unforgiving memories, the one certainty that remains is that I can't find a way to forgive myself. Maybe I never will. I'm not proud of my decision, but I'm hoping that sharing this will help someone understand what I went through. My name's Kyle, and I'm 34, just trying to navigate life when everything went sideways. You see, 2 years ago, my wife Emma and I bought a quaint little house, a fixer-upper nestled in a quiet neighborhood where the trees whispered sweet, serene secrets. It felt like a beacon of hope after the relentless grind of renting for what seemed like an eternity, and we agreed on a budget for renovations that might occasionally stretch, but within limits. Life was good until the weight of anxiety crept in like a shadow at dusk. Emma had lost her job, and the financial strain of the mortgage started gnawing at her like a rat gnaws at a meal left unattended. I saw the worry etched on her face, the sleepless nights, the way she would wake up gasping for breath after nightmares filled with us losing everything. It crushed me. I learned to juggle bills in silence, covering the late fees and the ever-growing utilities, and my heart ached while knowing she thought we were on the brink of disaster. So, one dark night, I made the choice to dig into my savings, a stash I had assembled over years for a rainy day, and paid off the mortgage without telling her. The feeling of liberation was exhilarating, a weight lifted, like I was clawing back control of our lives. I imagined how ecstatic Emma would be, picturing her sweet smile lighting up the room when I let her know. But that joy was short-lived because my plan collided with reality in a way I never saw coming. 3 days after I paid it off, Emma stumbled upon the paperwork while organizing our records, and what followed was a storm I never expected. The look on her face was a mix of confusion and hurt betrayal, eyes brimming with tears as she accused me of making unilateral decisions about our future, of stripping away her agency, and it was like a knife twisting in my gut. I tried to explain that my intentions were good, that I wanted to relieve her anxiety, but my words felt hollow, echoing against the walls of a home that suddenly felt suffocatingly small. That night, the house felt like a prison, each creak of the floorboards a reminder of our fraying connection. Emma was silent, her back turned to me, and I could hear the soft tremors of her sobs swallowing my attempts at reassurance. I knew I had crossed a line, but deep down, I believed paying off the mortgage would free us, that it was an act of love. But love, I learned the hard way, isn't about salvaging your happiness by sacrificing another's. Days turned into weeks, and while I thought the anger would fade, it only deepened her wounds. We barely spoke, and each passing moment felt like a countdown to an inevitable confrontation. I kept replaying old memories, how we laughed together, the way dreams of a loving family danced in her eyes, but now, they felt tainted, like dusty photographs hidden away in a forgotten album. I saw forgiveness, but it was clear that my actions were branded on the fabric of our relationship. I even tried to make additional gestures, cooking dinner, cleaning up, surprising her with flowers, but nothing seemed to bridge the gap my thoughtless act had created. One night, after she returned from a frail attempt at therapy, I saw her sitting at the table, head in hands, and it struck me, she wasn't just grieving over the house or the loss of security, she was mourning the trust we had shared, which I dismantled in a moment of selfish desperation. The feeling of loneliness wrapped around me tighter than the fear of losing her. She asked me if I would have still gone through with it if she had said no, and the question hung in the air like a dark storm cloud. I couldn't answer. Despite my intentions rooted in love, I had betrayed her in a way that felt unforgivable. Eventually, the conversation shifted from sorrow to futility. She no longer wanted to talk about what I had done, and the silence felt deafening. Emma found her own ways to cope. She buried herself in her career search but left a lingering coldness between us that spoke volumes. I watched in painful despair as she transformed from my once vibrant partner into someone barely recognizable. Her laughter became rare, and the light behind her eyes dimmed. I lost my job soon after, just a small startup going under during a market crash, and suddenly, I was in a deep pit of despair alongside her. We both were stuck in this bleak limbo of regret as the reality of my impulsive choice sank in, the irony not lost on me that the very act I thought would heal us had instead ushered us into a silent war. Friends who used to visit started avoiding our home, sensing the tension, the way we exchanged furtive glances during group gatherings that felt like a performance we were tired of rehearsing. One night, after a complicated dinner discussion turned into a screaming match over mundane chores, I realized the house felt tainted, a physical embodiment of our unraveling relationship. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear it all down and start fresh, but the reality was, we were still trapped in the bones of our choices. I kept asking myself if I was truly the asshole, if I had thrown away our marriage for a moment of misguided courage. I felt I had grown over the months, evolving into someone willing to admit his mistakes, preparing to restore what I could, but the damage was like a fracture that wouldn't mend. Then came the night everything changed, for better or worse, I still can't tell. Emma came home late, the smell of cheap wine clinging fiercely to her like a shadow. For the first time in months, she looked liberated, a spark of something flickering in her eyes. I hesitated, unsure of how to approach the storm brewing inside me. "I quit my job," she said bluntly as if it was an everyday revelation. My heart raced, shock, fear, confusion tangled together into one dense knot. Before I could ask anything, she continued, "I've been thinking a lot lately. About us. About me. About everything." I braced myself as she spoke, her words spilling out rapidly, tinged with an urgency I hadn't seen from her in ages. She explained that she needed to figure out who she was without what we built together, that maybe taking the reins of her life and allowing some distance could help her regain clarity about our future. A whirlwind of emotions cascaded through me, fear mingled with a bitter sense of pride. I thought I was trying to save us by taking control, but perhaps we needed to unravel ourselves separately. And that was when I made my latest decision. I needed to let her go so she could find herself. In that instant, saying goodbye felt like the hardest thing I had ever done. Emma had transformed into someone who was wronged but also became a mirror reflecting my own flaws, and with every hug, every word left unsaid, I wondered if we'd find our way back someday or if we were permanently marked by this tragedy of broken intentions. 6 months lived apart unfolded like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. Nights were filled with a loss that transformed into too many what-ifs threading through my mind. The haunting image of her walking out that door stayed with me, the sound of the lock clicking echoing like the final note of a lamenting melody. I learned to navigate the empty rooms, the silence a deafening reminder of what I had done and what I had lost. I still held on to the hope that maybe one day Emma would understand the depths of my love, even if it was colored by my mistakes, but every flicker of hope dimmed further away as the days passed. Ultimately, the walls of our home, that beacon of hope, crumbled under the weight of naivete, and I was left with memories and regrets, staring blankly at the corners that once held warmth, now forever shadowed by betrayal, wondering how one decision could change everything. I don't know if I'm the asshole, I've lived with this tumult of emotions that mire my soul, but I realized sometimes in our love, it's the things we hide, the choices we make in the name of love, that can lead us down an uncharted, dark path. I never thought I'd find myself in the middle of anyone else's drama, let alone become the villain in my own son's love story, but there's been this creeping horror shadowing my life since that night. It started innocently enough, with my 16-year-old son, Jacob, coming home one evening, eyes aglow, announcing that he had a girlfriend. Sophia was her name, a girl with striking blue hair and a personality that seemed to fill the very air around her. I could tell from the start she was trouble, but then again, what teen girl isn't? At first, I was just the hopeful parent, envisioning school dances and awkward family dinners, but as the days turned into weeks, my sentiments shifted. I noticed how her laughter would echo from his bedroom, the playful banter dripping with a familiarity that left me unsettled. My husband is never home due to his grueling work schedule, and I was left alone to navigate the minefield of teenage relationships. When I first heard the rumors from other parents about things happening behind closed doors, I said nothing. I reasoned it was just kids being kids, quickly swept away by the tides of hormones and puberty. But then came the day that tested my patience, my morals, and my sanity. Jacob, with his hopeful gaze, casually asked if he could invite Sophia to spend the night. My gut churned at the thought, trying to suppress the adult instincts roaring within me. I wanted to scream some parental platitudes about responsibility and respect, but instead, I went quiet. The night of the visit arrived, and I prepared a playbook of rules, laying down the law with a shaky voice about how there would be no closed doors, no funny business, only PG-rated card games and midnight snacks. I watched as Sophia rolled her eyes, but Jacob nodded along, truly believing we could play house without crossing boundaries. As the hours passed, I could hear them laughing through the thin walls, the sound clashing with my anxiety until it festered into a fever pitch. I had one eye on my watch, and the other on my phone, biting my nails down to the quick, when I finally resolved to do something that would spell the disaster waiting to unfold. I marched upstairs, heart pounding, and threw open the door without a second thought. I can still picture the sight that greeted my eyes. Jacob and Sophia froze on the edge of his bed, layered together like two puzzle pieces that didn't quite fit. My gut twisted into a tight knot of dread and embarrassment, infuriated at my own impulsivity. I barked at them in a voice I hardly recognized as my own. "What do you think you're doing?" The startled expressions on their faces tipped the scales from shock to anger within moments. Jacob accused me of invading his space, of not trusting him, while Sophia's lip curled in disdain, making it clear I was the meddling villain in their love story. They squared off against me like I was the enemy, and in a fit of rage fueled by parental instincts and the panicked beat of my heart, I shouted more than I should have, an unintentionally hostile outburst that left them both speechless. "If you can't respect my rules, then you can't have her here at all." I had never seen Jacob's eyes, usually filled with joy and mischief, darken so quickly. He lashed back at me with a ferocity I didn't expect, hurling insults and swearing I had ruined his life. In my mind, I was just safeguarding my son's future. Did he not care how this would affect his education or his future friendships? The remaining hours that night became a haunted silence. After Sophia left, there was no comforting snuggle on the couch or heartwarming family moments. It was a chasm of resentment settling between us. Jacob's demeanor changed overnight. He started sneaking out, arriving home only when he felt like it, returning reeking of rebellion and adolescent woes. Our once easy conversations became cold exchanges, thick with unspoken resentment, and I found myself tiptoeing around my own home, desperate to avoid another clash. I couldn't help but wonder if Sophia had whispered poison into his ear, or if he had merely turned to her as an escape from my overbearing nature. Days turned into weeks, and the shadows thickened further, weaving anxiety and guilt into nightmares where I would wake in a fit of sweat, panicked that I had made the wrong choice. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get worse, a week before Jacob's birthday, I got an unexpected call from the school. The voice on the other end delivered a blow that twisted my insides. "We need to talk about Jacob and Sophia. There's a serious issue we need to address." My heart raced as I pictured what disastrous scenario might unfold. Were they caught? Were they in trouble? When I arrived, the words hit me like a freight train. They'd gotten caught in the back of a school dance, pursuing their own version of love in a world that wouldn't understand. I barely made it through the conversation with the principal, blurred images of Jacob's fighting back tears merging with my own horror at the thought of everyone knowing. I returned home, my breath shaky, armed with the understanding that I had unwittingly pushed him further into Sophia's web. That night, as I lay in bed, a heavy darkness overshadowed my thoughts, grappling with the regret of my choices. What was I doing wrong? How could I fix it? Did I care more about my ideals than my son's happiness? I woke with a fragile resolve, deciding to reach out to him, to actually listen. How could I have been so blind? And when I did approach him with that open heart and vulnerability, expecting a bridge to mend, I found him slumped on his bed, scrolling through his phone as if I were a ghost haunting his space. Weeks turned into silent standoffs, but just as I felt the weight of impending loss, I finally caught a break, an unexpected glimpse of hope. One day, out of the blue, Jacob shuffled into the living room. "Sophia's gone," he whispered, dropping those two words like stones that splashed in still water. The heartbreak in his voice cut deep as he spoke of their split, of how her blue hair was now just a childhood memory painted over the walls of his mind. I didn't dare ask why. I didn't dare say anything at all. Instead, we sat in that strange silence, the kind that once filled the void between us but now gave birth to understanding. Maybe I wasn't the complete asshole in this banter of teenage love and rebellion, maybe I was just a parent trying to do the right thing, albeit the wrong way. And as he slowly opened up about his heartache, I realized the layers of my failure, and love, could perpetuate pain. I had a choice, to let this consume me, to drown in expectations of what I thought parenting should entail, or to bare my heart to the truth. I became acutely aware then, that in the fragile world between us, a bridge to hope was forming, the essence of forgiveness that traveled through those hushed moments, guided by the fragility of healing. As we began to talk, not as parent and child, but just two people navigating this chaotic world, I buried any remnants of anger, learned to respect his choices and autonomy, and prayed that this lesson might lead to more than just social media posts or late-night fears. In that moment, I realized that perhaps the greatest act of love is to let go and to learn from the usurping shadows of regret, reminding myself that this delicate dance of love, loss, and redemption was not merely a plot twist in our lives, it was what made us human. Last week I shared the eerie secrets I stumbled upon when I overheard my mother whispering in the kitchen late at night, her voice a trembling hush that seemed to draw shadows out of the corners, and what happened sent shivers racing down my spine. In my last post, I detailed how she was tangled up in a web of half-spoken phrases, words that dripped from her lips like melting wax, urging her to keep them away and that they can see us. And though I was convinced at first that it was just the musings of a sleep-deprived mind or remnants of nightmares chasing her into the waking world, there was something unsettling about her demeanor, a sharpness in her motherly warmth that made me feel like an outsider in our own home. As those whispers gnawed at my curiosity, I hung on every syllable until finally, a few nights ago, I crept down the hall, heart racing against the echoes of her warnings, and there she was again, the tension in the air thick enough to slice. My breath caught in my throat as I pressed myself against the wall to listen more closely, catching snippets of her sorrowful mutterings about the door and how it always watches, alongside the names I had never heard before, names that turned my stomach: Owen, Elijah, Clara. Each carried a weight that hinted at stories far darker than I could fathom. The mention of those names dragged up foul visions from my childhood, ghost stories told in hurried whispers on stormy nights where monsters lurked just beyond the reach of the light and nightmares danced behind closed eyes. Desperate for answers, I needed to confront her, but a part of me was terrified of what I might unravel, so I stayed silent as I watched her, convinced that within her fragile happiness lay a secret too perilous to understand, and with her big, sorrow-filled eyes, she carried an ache that seemed to tether her to a reality steeped in grief and fear. The days passed in eerie quiet. Each evening as I watched the sun dip below the horizon, the shadows deepening in their embrace, I felt the suffocating pull of dread wrapping around me, until finally, I'd had enough, so that night, after she had retreated to her room, I resolved to scour the house for anything that might explain the whispers, searching desperately for clues, opening every drawer, peeling back every rug, while the darkness curled and shifted, but the mundane shelves revealed nothing except dust-riddled memories of my mother's attempts to create a warm, happy home, cluttered mementos that felt like lies, until I stumbled upon an old trunk buried beneath a tattered blanket in the closet that felt charged. Breathing beneath my fingertips, and prying the lid open, I found journals stacked neatly, their pages yellowed with age and filled with frantic scrawls, threads of her life spilling out like breadcrumbs leading me deeper into her memories. The first few entries were mundane, talks of work and dinner plans, but as the inkless pen flowed, something switched in her hand, and the words morphed into frantic rants about the house. My mother believed our home housed something sinister, something ancient and watching, and she described the way they spoke to her through whispers in the dark, naming them the keepers, claiming they predated the very ground we stood upon, luring me in with the insatiable hunger of fear, her ink detailing a history of strange occurrences, fleeting shadows darting past windows, the unsettling echoes of a child's laughter when she was alone, and then there was that dread-filled entry detailing the bedroom door, how it creaked open at 3 a.m. every night, always revealing darkness so thick it felt viscous, her plea to keep it locked and the statement repeated so many times it felt like a mantra as I clutched the pages till they threatened to tear. With every revelation, my heart raced, the weight of the words slamming down on me, and I stumbled backward as if struck by a physical force. A name leapt from the pages, Clara, the same name she whispered in the kitchen, and I froze as the gravity of it crystallized in my mind. But the latest entry was what curdled my blood, dated just a week before, where she recorded her decision to leave our house, to escape whatever dark presence lurked within its walls, and the last line sent tidal waves of horror crashing into my mind. Tonight, when the door opens again, I won't be here, I'll take them with me. In a panic, I slammed the trunk shut, my mind racing through the implications, struggling to comprehend what they meant, or who they were, when suddenly a sound froze me in place. It was a whisper, a low, cold whisper that snaked around the edges of fear, slithering through the air and wrapping around my throat, a voice that felt all too familiar. It was my mother, standing at the entrance of the hallway, eyes glazed and hollow, a frigid smile on her lips, and as she spoke, my heart sank. She looked right through me, a vacant shell in place of the woman I once knew, and warned me softly, "You shouldn't have read those, sweetheart. They don't like it when we talk." The first time I noticed something was off was on my walk home from work when I saw my neighbor staggering out of his house, eyes wild, clothes disheveled, like he had just survived a war zone instead of a typical Tuesday. He kept muttering under his breath, "They'll find me, they'll find me," before he spotted me watching from the sidewalk and bolted like a startled animal back inside, slamming the door behind him. I brushed it off as another case of the midweek blues. Life in our quiet suburb had its oddities, but then the next day, Mrs. Henderson, the sweet elderly woman who always tended her roses, started walking the streets at midnight, her nightgown dragging in the dew, whispering to the shadows as though she were expecting company. Before long, whispers spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. People were disappearing, not just leaving, but vanishing into thin air. The first was a local mechanic named Bill. One day, he was fixing a flat tire for a customer, and the next, his workshop was empty, save for his tools rusting under a layer of dust. We all figured he had lost it and skipped town, but then Dawn, the librarian, went missing too, and the rumors turned ugly, festering dread spilling over every backyard barbecue until there was a dark cloud of anxiety hanging over our community. I started to probe my own life, check the locks, keep the blinds drawn tight. It was when I found Nora, my daughter, crouched in a corner of her room, her face pale and focused on something I could not see, that the paranoia truly set in. I asked her what was wrong, and she whispered back, "Daddy, they're coming." She said it so casually, like she was worried about an impending thunderstorm instead of whatever terror lurked outside. I tried to reassure her, telling her monsters are just made-up stories to scare kids, but inside, I felt the cold touch of fear creep down my spine. Over the next few weeks, people kept disappearing, each one frantic in their last days, avoiding eye contact, bolting for their homes at the first sign of dusk, until the neighborhood was nearly empty. I remember sitting on the porch as the sun dipped behind the trees, listening to the sound of silence that felt thicker than before, and I couldn't help but feel like a scene from a horror movie where everyone knows they need to escape but are frozen in place. I convinced myself that there had to be something that connected these disappearances, perhaps they had found some dark truth about life here that had driven them to hide, but each time I turned the idea over, it felt like chasing shadows. I decided to put my theories to the test by going to the woods behind our neighborhood, a place we had always seen but rarely ventured into. It was said that a hidden community lived among the trees, filled with people who chose to flee from society, but I needed to know. It was deeper and darker than I had expected, the path became twisted, the trees arrayed like sentinels, and underfoot, the earth squelched in a way that echoed the growing dread inside me. I pressed on, a foolish adventurer listening to nothing but the sound of my footsteps, until I stumbled across a clearing with a ramshackle cabin revealing the slightest hint of light peeking through its cracked window. My heart raced as I approached, curiosity and terror battling within me, until I caught sight of movement within, shadows darting, whispering, laughter that felt wrong in its pitch. I hesitated at the door, the chill of reality washing over me, the stories I had heard of a place no one returned from, of people who never really died but rather exchanged their lives for something darker, cut the air thick around me. It was then I realized the menacing truth: they weren't dead, they had found a way to hide, to slip through the cracks of existence as if the world had no hold on them. My breath hitched as I turned to run, but it was too late. The door swung open, and there stood faces I recognized, dying laughter bleeding through twisted smiles, my neighbors who were never supposed to be here, never supposed to find me. They called my name, smooth and sickly sweet, as I stumbled backward, my only desire to escape from whatever hollow maniacal truth they had merged into them. They whispered of a sanctuary, a place where fear could be cast away, where the dark currents of our society could be washed clean. I understood then that the threat was not in death itself, but in what thrived in the space between the living and the dead. They had turned the very idea of existence into a convoluted nightmare. As I bolted down the path, my instincts screamed at me to run, but I could hear them behind me, their voices weaving in and out of reality, growing closer, more alluring with every frantic step I took. And I knew in that moment it wouldn't be long until they would come for my daughter, where darkness lingers not to claim souls, but to harvest fear, feeding off the shadows of ignorance where we think we are safe. Now every night, I lock the doors, and as the sun sets, I can feel the weight of all those who once called this place home. They don't die, they hide beneath the skin of our community, preserving their truth in the seams of reality, waiting for nights where the veil grows thin and darkness takes form. And I have found my own shadow creeping, whispering to me, waiting for me to give in. I should have just taken the other elevator, that thought ran through my mind repeatedly as I stood frozen in the metallic confines of the small, flickering lit elevator that was currently descending into the depths of the crumbling apartment complex I had moved into just 6 months ago. It wasn't my first choice, but I had been desperate and the rent was cheap. The windows barely opened, and the walls were riddled with cracks that seemed to whisper secrets I couldn't quite grasp. As the elevator slowed to a stop, an unsettling jolt that sent a shiver down my spine, my gut twisted, warning me of the dread that lay beyond those doors. I had noticed oddities since I'd moved in, strange noises echoing through the walls at odd hours, shadows darting just out of sight, an overwhelming sense of being watched that clung to me like a wet blanket. Still, I disregarded the warnings. Who wouldn't want to save a few bucks? Gathering my courage, I pressed the button marked B for basement, hoping to retrieve another box of my belongings that I had hastily shoved in storage during my move-in, the apartment being too small for my amassed junk. The elevator was cramped, smelling of rust and something vaguely akin to mold, but I forced myself to focus on the task at hand until the lights flicked ominously, cutting out for a heartbeat and plunging me into darkness. Then, the fluorescent lights flickered back to life and I caught a fleeting glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, something long and pale, trailing shadows, but when I turned my head, there was nothing. My heart began to race, the quiet hum of my own breathing mingling with my mounting anxiety as I tried to shake off the encounter. A moment later, the elevator doors creaked open with a jarring shudder, revealing the cavernous basement that felt more like a tomb than a storage area. I stepped out cautiously, the stale air hitting my face like a brick, and my eyes struggled to adjust to the dim lighting of the overhead bulbs that swayed like pendulums above me. A faint neon sign flickered in the distance, illuminating a long corridor lined with locked doors, each numbered but largely forgotten, as I made my way past in search of my unit. But then I stumbled across something strange, an open door, its darkness yawning like a mouth ready to swallow me whole, and alongside it were muffled thuds and soft cries, an unmistakable sound of a struggle. My instinct screamed at me to turn back, but curiosity drove me closer, my feet almost moving of their own volition as I peered inside. What I saw chilled my blood. A young woman, disheveled and wild-eyed, was chained to the wall, her body trembling as she looked up at me, desperation etched into her face, and before I could utter a word, a voice, a deep, guttural growl, rumbled from the shadows, "You shouldn't have come here." I stumbled back, realizing with dawning horror that the voice belonged to something hunched and distorted just out of sight, draped in what seemed to be rags that faintly glistened with remnants of something unspeakable. I turned to run, but another voice called calmly to me, a young boy's voice echoing from down the hall, "Help my sister, please." Panic surged through me, and I wrestled with my gut, knowing this was wrong. Everything about this felt wrong, yet my feet were shackled by an unseen force, an unrelenting compulsion to linger. "You weren't supposed to take this elevator," the growl came again, closer this time, sending a shock of fear down my spine as I bolted towards the exit, my heart pounding relentlessly against my ribcage. Terrified, I barreled my way back through the door and into that insipid elevator, slamming the button for the ground floor so hard I was surprised it didn't shatter under my force. As the elevator lurched upward, I thought I was safe, that I had escaped whatever nightmare lurked in the basement. But the lights flickered again, more dark than flicker, and the air shifted in that confined space. The hum turned to an agonizing growl, and then suddenly the elevator stopped with a harsh metallic clang. I felt a presence behind me, an otherworldly chill that crawled along my back, creeping up my neck. I dared not turn around but could feel the suffocating weight of something sinister, right there. The mirrors against the elevator walls began to warp, the reflection twisting into an elongated face with hollow eyes, a mouth stretched into a horrid smile that didn't belong in this world. "You're not getting away that easily," it hissed, and I screamed, a raw sound clawing its way out of my throat as I pounded against the elevator doors, desperate to escape. Finally, with a violent burst, the doors flew open, and I stumbled out, gasping for breath, finding myself standing in the lobby of my building. I glanced back at the elevator, hoping against hope that whatever had been lurking there wasn't following me, and turned to run for the exit just as the lights flickered one last time. But in that flickering light, I caught sight of the boy from the basement standing in the corner, his eyes pleading and wide, not for help but for my silence, a warning. I fled into the night, the air rushing past me, not daring to look back, the weight of what I'd seen pressing upon me like a leaden blanket. It wasn't until I reached my car, keys trembling in my hand, that I realized I hadn't just escaped, I had left them behind. And though the streets flooded past me as I drove home, I felt the unbearable burden of their haunting cries clawing at my sanity. What I had witnessed in that basement would never truly leave me. I should have just taken the other elevator. I never thought I'd find myself on a subreddit like r/nosleep, sharing my darkest moment instead of light-hearted anecdotes or playful banter, but I'm writing this as a warning, hoping someone out there can learn from my mistake. It started last month when my husband, Mark, who had always been sweet but often lacked spontaneity, returned home with an entirely different demeanor. At first, it was disarming, the way he would greet me with an exaggerated enthusiasm, weaving an almost theatrical charm into his greetings, like someone who'd just discovered joy for the first time. "Honey. Guess what? I made us dinner, your favorite." He'd beam, and I couldn't help but smile at the passion he poured into his words, though a twinge of unease tugged at my gut. However, as the days wore on, this forcefully nice persona began to feel suffocating, as if he were trying too hard to mask something deeper, something darker. One evening, I walked into the living room only to find Mark rearranging the furniture, again, with that same eerie enthusiasm, much to my confusion. "It'll bring us closer. Don't you love it?" he asked, practically bouncing on his feet, but I felt the air thicken around him, a tension that was becoming all too familiar. I snapped, my voice slicing through the over-caffeinated excitement, "Why are you being so weird? I can't take this forced cheerfulness anymore." The moment those words left my mouth, a shadow fell over his face, and his grin faltered, but an unsettling stillness lingered after I'd yelled, as if the room had trapped us in a bubble of unspoken dread. He didn't respond, and instead, the next day, he enveloped me in a bubble of forced niceness, bringing me coffee and laying out plans for extravagant date nights, all while hitting that same ominous enthusiasm that made my skin crawl. I began to notice other things, his phone that had been glued to his hand, the way he occasionally stood too still, as if listening for something just beyond the edge of hearing, and the shadows under his eyes that deepened with every passing day. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was not my husband, This was a puppet, and I was slowly becoming his marionette. My anxiety spiked, and I started pulling my phone out at night, digging through the depths of r/no sleep, searching for tales of possession or supernatural forces, questioning if Mark had been replaced or if I had. Then, one night, while he was taking a shower, I stumbled across a journal tucked away in the back of our closet, hidden under an avalanche of winter clothes. It was his, and flipping through the pages filled me with dread. The writing was frantic, scratched out in messy handwriting, detailing how he'd felt trapped under the weight of my expectations, how he'd wished he could be the partner I wanted, almost as if he had sacrificed a piece of his soul to make me happy. My heart sank as I realized what this forcefully nice behavior truly was, a warped attempt to fulfill those desires chronicled in the barely legible pages. That revelation shattered something within me. Half of me wanted to rage against the expectations I never imposed, while the other half echoed back to his words, "I just want to be what you need." It was that night, after tossing and turning in bed, that I awoke to hear him talking softly to himself in the dark. I leaned against the wall, straining to catch every word, my breath hitching in my throat. "If I can just make her happy," he murmured, "then it'll all be worth it. I'll just keep trying." A chill threaded through my spine, and I felt a surge of anger against the night nurse in those tales I read, the one who, in their desperation to care for others, lost their own identity along the way, as if abandoning pieces of themselves in the name of happiness. Unable to bear the weight of it anymore, I confronted him the following morning, bursting into the kitchen like an arrow shot from a taut bowstring, demanding to know what he was so afraid of, what had changed him into this caricature of himself. His entire expression faltered for a moment, brows furrowing deeply before that mask snapped back into place, harder and more joyful than ever. "I'm just being the best husband I can be. I want you to smile." The realization hit me harder than any love confrontation. He was losing himself inside this warped version of niceness, unable to grasp that true love isn't always built on a foundation of performance. Just as tears pricked my eyes, his smile cracked into an unfamiliar expression, something almost sad, and I recognized that beneath the surface, there lay a darkness I was only beginning to graze. "You'll understand soon," he whispered, a low vibration that echoed through the sunny kitchen, sending the silverware rattling as if the universe itself was bracing itself for impending catastrophe. Since then, sleep has become a stranger. I toss and turn, haunted by thoughts of how far from reality he's drifted while I've remained anchored to sanity, yet I can't help but see shadows trailing behind him every time he walks into the room, flickering at the edges of everything that he was. And as each day passes, I can hear the echo of his laughter growing dimmer, each note faded, tinged with something I can't quite grasp. So here I sit, fingers trembling above the keyboard, an unwitting participant trapped in a dance that began as pure intent but has evolved into something grotesque, an echo of my fear winding in and out of the ordinary, and all I want is to swaddle him in reality's embrace while holding on to my own sanity. But what if I lose him in the process? I can feel the words swelling inside, but the true question remains, who is the one really trapped in this web of forced kindness? Ida? When I started working from home, I noticed my kids, Jack and Lily, began acting strangely around me. At first, I didn't think much of it. Every parent experiences the teenage cold shoulder. But things took an unusual turn last month when, out of nowhere during a minor argument about chores, Jack spat the word pervert at me with a venom that chilled my blood. I laughed it off, thinking it was just a teenage outburst, but their usage of the word became more frequent, more deliberate. Every time I asked them to do something or set boundaries, I was met with that word, that accusation. I found myself drowning in confusion and worry, unable to comprehend where this was coming from. I tried talking to them, explaining that words have weight, that they should be careful with their accusations, but my attempts only fueled their aggression. I even caught Lily whispering on the phone, describing our interactions with a distorted perspective to someone unknown. Desperate for answers, I briefly considered hacking into their phones but decided against it. I didn't want to become the very monster they seemed to think I was. So, I turned to the next logical step, therapy. We met with Dr. Havers, a kind-eyed woman who glanced at me with what felt like the sympathy you'd reserve for a sick animal. My wife, Julie, stood by me, but I could sense her unease. She wanted this sorted for the kids' sake, oblivious to the deeper implications. During the session, the kids remained eerily silent, stonewalling any progress. Dr. Havers suggested family activities to rebuild trust, but it was during these sessions that the whispers returned, louder and more dissonant. One night, I overheard Lily recounting our therapy details in excruciating detail to someone through the thin walls. Curiosity finally overrode my ethics. I timed my actions around her scheduled social outing and accessed her phone. What I found was a conversation thread with someone known only as the mentor. My heart sank as I read through messages that cast me as a deviant, followed by coaching responses, urging Lily to record our interactions to gather evidence. More terrifying were suggestions to escalate accusations, specific days on the calendar with instructions to create opportunities and enlist Jack's help. I was missing something critical here. There was a puppet master orchestrating my downfall. The name the mentor stirred something familiar, like a half-remembered dream. I scoured my mind, late into the night, then it hit me. A local parenting forum I used to frequent often counseled by a seemingly benevolent figure dispensing advice to troubled teens. I pulled up the forum, sifting through pages of advice columns until I found them, detailed scripts advising dissatisfied teens on faux abuse narratives. I felt sick. Lily and Jack weren't just angry kids, they were manipulated soldiers in a personal vendetta. The therapist's solution was useless. I needed something drastic, something that could expose the truth. Armed with a newfound resolve, I decided to challenge the mentor, constructing a digital trap that could capture proof of their unlawful grooming. Meanwhile, I fortified my relationship with the kids through genuine communication, slowly persuading them of a sinister nature behind these virtual whisperings. The plan was to draw them out, to trick this faceless entity into revealing itself, but even as I set things into motion, I could feel the noose tighten around my neck with every disastrous family interaction. The mentor seemed to anticipate my every move, sending encouraging whispers to the kids to stay strong, to not be swayed by manipulative arguments. Julie, oblivious to the dark undercurrents, began questioning my sanity when I broached the subject. To the outside world, I was just another paranoid dad on the brink. Days turned to weeks, the mentor torpedoed friendships and frayed bonds, whispering accolades to Lily and Jack for their resolve in fighting the good fight. My covert crusade into the digital underworld yielded nothing but derailed tracks leading into voids, encrypted messages, defunct websites, cyberspace echoes of a silken voice encouraging rebellion. Then, unexpectedly, there was a breakthrough. During a moment of sophomore internet bravado, Jack slipped, revealing the handles of forum threads where they connected with the mentor. The web cocktail of truth was mixed with what little energy remained within me. With every swipe and click, the threads unraveled stories of digital disobedience, twisted narratives, entire families falling prey just like us. Why us? I had asked Jack one evening, genuinely curious beyond anger or desperation. His reply was chilling in its simplicity, because you need to be taught a lesson. The realization was gut-wrenching. The mentor was more than a leaderless forum phantom. It was a collective, a legion of disillusioned individuals bent on teaching arbitrary life lessons through chaos. With newfound clarity, I went nuclear, drawing upon every last shred of familial instinct to save my children from the digital abyss. I invested myself wholly into their trust, tearing down the digital pedestals the mentor had erected, and slowly, with persistence edging on obsession, we dissected the threads together. It was painfully slow, a raw process that reopened old wounds, but with every exposé, the words pervert became less laden with stigma and more like a symbol of misunderstanding. Little by little, as the faceless menace lost its vice, the kids returned to themselves, shedding their armor of defiance against a father they barely recognized when under siege. As our family mended within the warmth of reconciliation, I couldn't shake the damaged trust and made the decision with Julie to relocate, carving out a fresh start, a new life distanced from the electronic voices that once sought to rend us apart. Am I asshole for telling my sister no to taking in her kids? It seems like a simple question, and maybe at first glance, I am the asshole. But once you hear what happened, maybe you'll understand. It was just after midnight when the first call came through. My sister Clara was hysterical, barely coherent, her voice nothing but a trembling whisper mingling with the static and crackle of a poor connection. They came back, she managed to choke out before the line abruptly went dead. My heart pounded like a tribal drum in my chest, questions swirling in my mind like a swarm of angry wasps. Only a week ago, Clara had confessed about the ominous visits she'd been receiving, things she couldn't explain and that defied reason, a feeling of being watched, shadows creeping along walls, doors opening in the dead of night. I brushed it off as stress. She was now a single mother of two energetic boys after the tragic and sudden passing of her husband, Kevin, in a supposed hit-and-run accident. She'd become paranoid, understandable given her circumstances. But when the house phone rattled against its cradle and her line went silent once more, I grabbed my car keys and headed to her house, the dark highway unfolding like a predatory beast under my headlights. The house was eerily still when I arrived, an unsettling air that made the hair on the back of my neck stand upright. I pushed the front door open, and an oppressive silence flooded over me. Clara's home, once filled with laughter and the exuberance of young children, now felt hollow, like a tomb. "Clara?" I called out, my voice echoing into the void. A shiver ran down my spine as I moved deeper into the house. The hallway light flickered nervously as I approached the living room, and there I found them, Clara huddled in a corner, clutching her children, her eyes wide and glistening like those of a hunted animal. She looked up at me, desperation etched deep into her features, stammering for me to understand the severity of what was happening. "They're everywhere," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the thudding of my heart. "Watching, lurking. Always waiting." Any lingering skepticism I held evaporated. There was a tangible darkness in the house, a malevolent presence that seemed to throb with its own energy. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay, but the truth caught in my throat. I'd felt it too, the oppressive gaze from the shadows, like multitudes of eyes, each pinning us in place. Then, a dull, resonant thrumming shook the house, emanating from the very floors beneath us. The windows rattled in their frames as I felt an involuntary chill climb my spine. Clara's children whimpered, clutching their mother tighter, their small bodies trembling with fear. "Please, take them," she pleaded, desperation clinging to her words. She pointed to a suitcase she'd packed, as if expecting me to whisk her sons away, to give them a refuge from whatever terror plagued her home. But something primal screamed at me not to take a step further. It was a strange, uncanny sensation, a voice, their voice perhaps, reverberating within my skull. An incoherent whisper, promising no, demanding that they stay. My legs felt like lead as Clara begged me once more, tears streaming down her face, her body racked with sobs. And it was the boys I looked at then, really looked into their eyes. For the briefest moment, their pupils seemed to shift, like shadows darting through their gaze before it vanished into normalcy. Yet, that slip was enough to root me in place, a cold realization prickling along my skin. I knew then, without a shadow of a doubt, they weren't safe, but neither was I or anyone else. The darkness had marked them, claimed their fragile, innocent lives as an entry into our world. I staggered back, my heart pounding in my ears, the air around me growing thicker, weightier. I felt it would swallow me whole if I allowed it. Rational thought was unspooling fast, and the urge to flee was overwhelming. I backed away slowly, hearing Clara's voice following me, rising in panic, her pleas twisting into accusations. I should have carried those boys to safety, taken them away, but something prevented me as if invisible hands held me in check. The air shivered, growing dense with a presence I couldn't deny. It hung between us, a choice, a barrier, a warning. The moment I crossed the threshold with those children would mark my fate and theirs as inextricably bound to whatever watched from the darkened corners. I left the house, staggered into the night, every instinct urging me to bold, to drive as fast and as far from them as I could. Clara's cries echoed in my mind as I stumbled back to my car, feeling the weight of guilt and fear pressing down on me like a vice as the darkness swallowed me whole. I considered reaching out, telling someone, but who would believe me? Perhaps this was her reality now, or mine if I let it. Silent whispers still echo in my dreams, pulling me back to those nightmarish moments. I find myself questioning the boundaries of reality, teetering on the edge of an unsettling truth. Was I the asshole for leaving them there, or would taking them have unleashed something far worse? Late at night, long after the town has sunk into a mournful quiet, I still hear Clara's desolate voice, calling out from the dark, her words a chilling refrain that never fades.